All right, again, welcome to the 14th CRC Roundtable, our monthly virtual seminar series. And just briefly, if you haven't been with us before, our intention is to host these targeted, inclusive, and informed conversations where we match scientific advances with management needs.
That's what I need.
The webinars are designed for contribution, not consumption. So each seminar invites a diverse range of researchers, managers, or other professionals to have conversations around critical topics in order to build connectivity and increase our collective competency for decision-making. As a reflection of that intent, the panelists have been given about 25 minutes total to make some introductory remarks, allowing 30 minutes for discussion. And this is all about us, giving us a place to ask the clumsy questions and to practice the bravery and humility necessary. At each of these webinars, we've begun by answering the question, why this topic at this time by these speakers? As per topic, according to the World Conservation Union, invasive alien species are the second most significant threat to biodiversity after habitat loss. In fact, about 42% of threatened or endangered species are at risk due to invasive species. And I think we've seen, even with a slight dent in this because of COVID, but over the recent decades, globalization has increased the movement of people and goods around the world. And so a 2017 study found that over 1/3 of all introductions in the past 200 years occurred after 1970. Excuse me. And the rate of introductions is showing no sign of slowing down. And in fact, I put up this graph about projecting actually the number of alien species through 2050. And you can see that really the study predicts overall that the number of established alien species will increase by about 36% between 2005 and 2050. Why this time? There are already more than 200 known or possible invasive species in the Chesapeake Bay region, but it's really time to not only think about the ones that have arrived here to date, but that our consideration of alien species be incorporated into climate change policies. We're talking about habitats such as temperate forest and freshwater systems that currently have thermal barriers that limit the establishment of alien species, but those are about to become more suitable as the climate changes. So the topic is quite timely, and the conversation is needed urgently. Why these speakers? I'm so excited about the two speakers we have today. They each have a long history of discovery about the variety of invasive species and the range of impacts that they can have on ecosystem services. And they work tirelessly in both their cases to communicate that science to public audiences and to engage the public in management and control, because obviously we're going to need everybody. So let me tell you just a little bit about each one of them, and maybe something you wouldn't know if you just looked up their CVs or their resumes. Amy Corman is a horticulture extension educator based in Northampton and Lehigh counties. She responsibilities are far-ranging in terms of research-based solutions for landscape problems. She also has a great experience as a medical entomologist with the military, which is pretty fascinating. And I love her characterization of her field, where if it creeps, crawls, slithers, slinks, or flies, she's got it covered. In each one of these speakers is sort of a rock star in terms of movies. I actually watched Amy give a talk that's called Ending the Anguish of Spotted Lanternfly Infestations. And Ryan will be speaking after Amy. Ryan Davis joined the Alliance for Chesapeake Bay in April 2017. He's the Pennsylvania Forest Projects Manager. He focuses on forest conservation and restoration within the watershed across Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New York. And he's also got lots of wonderful videos online, and he has a wonderful beagle named Newt that shows up frequently. And so with that, I'll just remind you that speakers, we really want to, I guess, reserve the time for discussion and questions. I'm sure each of you could fill an hour by yourselves. I'll gracefully let you know when you are getting short on time. And if you have material that you're unable to share because of that time limit, we'll find a way to make your slides or remarks available. And so the most important part of this hour is the opportunity for attendees to be able to ask the brave and clumsy questions. So please help me do that. And with that, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Amy.
Thank you and good morning. So let's pull up some slides here. All right, I'm assuming that's good, and you'll let me know if it's not. So thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Again, my name is Amy Corman. I am a horticulture extension educator at Penn State, but I am an entomologist by training. And so this morning I thought I would frame this discussion about invasive species around community engagement in research and management. And excuse me. And I'm going to use the example of the spotted lanternfly to show you how we teach the public what is at risk, and then in encouraging people to help. So as we get started, I just want to give you a little bit of background about the spotted lanternfly in case you don't know that much about it, but just to set the stage for what I'll get into later. But here's the adult spotted lanternfly. Spotted lanternfly is not a fly, nor is it a moth. It's often referred to as either one of those, but it is a full-gourd plant hopper that's native to parts of Asia. The spotted lanternfly has sucking mouth parts, and it feeds on plant sap. It's a large insect, and it feeds on a lot of plant sap throughout its life. It was found in the southeastern part of Pennsylvania in Berks County in 2014, and now we find it in 11 different states. So how did it get to all these places? Well, it originally arrived via international commerce, either on packing materials or on some stone that was being shipped. The point is, it is an excellent hitchhiker, and that's part of our problem. So here's the spotted lanternfly's life cycle. There's only one generation per year in Pennsylvania. It overwinters in egg masses that are very effectively camouflaged on just about anything, including trees, rocks, patio furniture, benches, firewood, and lots of materials where it's very difficult to find. The eggs hatch in the spring. There's 4 nymphal instar stages, and by late July, we begin to see the adults. Adult females begin to lay their eggs in September, and they will continue, the adult stage will continue to persist until it is killed by hard frosts. So in case anybody's wondering, our winter temperatures here in Pennsylvania are apparently have little effect on this survival of the general population, because they are still here after this many years. And so it's important to understand why there is so much concern about the spotted lanternfly. And it also is really important getting the public to be able to recognize this organism in all of its life stages so that they can sort of help to prevent hitchhiking. So the spotted lanternfly has a really broad host range. It was first noted as a nuisance in residential landscapes. These really are large insects, found often in high numbers, feeding on plant sap, producing honeydew. Honeydew attracts stinging insects, and honeydew is also a substrate for sooty mold. These opportunistic fungi, that may cover things that are covered with honeydew. And if you have a significant spotted lanternfly infestation, the whole area can develop this stinky, nasty, sour smell because of all of the feeding, the honeydew, the building up of sooty mold and other nasty things. So as we look at this insect, the number of hosts continues to expand with our knowledge of the lanternfly. So current records show that spotted lanternfly feeds on over 70 different host plants. And one host, the Lanthus altissima, or tree of heaven, it's also an invasive problem in its own right in our landscapes. So we teach people how to identify this tree. This broad host range adds so much complexity in trying to control the lanternfly, and it's a problem for people in many different ways. So number one, it damages grapevines. Vineyards appear to take a huge hit from intense feeding of the spotted lanternfly. And when spotted lanternflies attack grapes, basically, they are literally sucking away resources that plants need in order to sustain themselves for new growth in the spring. Feeding damage makes vines more susceptible to winter kill. And so we already have documentation of yield losses and also increased costs to vineyards because they are using many more pesticide applications to try to control this insect. So that's a problem. Secondly, spotted lanternflies do have an impact on trees. Does it kill trees? Well, we're confident in saying that the spotted lanternfly is a critical tree stressor that makes trees susceptible to other insect infestations or infections by pathogens. What happens when a spotted lanternfly feeds on, when you have hundreds, thousands of spotted lanternflies feeding on a single tree? Well, you can get this discoloration of leaves and some dead branches. Often we will see these weeping wounds because they've jammed all these mouth parts into a tree and the sap will leak out. And this will attract bees and ants and wasps. When we looked at this impact of this insect, originally we were looking at agricultural sectors in Pennsylvania, and they took a look at, well, how would this possibly affect the nursery industry? Well, it's anticipated that it could take longer to produce saleable trees because, and this probably is related to the development of watershed areas where you have wooded areas. At high numbers, spotted lanternfly really stresses trees and it causes a reduction in growth and tree health. So you've got reduced photosynthesis and carbohydrate stores. It's another way that spotted lanternfly is making trees more susceptible to other things in the environment. And another issue is, as I mentioned before, spotted lanternflies produce this sooty mold or produce honeydew, upon which sooty mold grows. And if you have a large area with lots of spotted lanternflies, it just rains honeydew. And the whole understory underneath these trees is just coated in honeydew, and then it's coated in sooty mold. And those leaves out there that should be doing photosynthesis can't do it anymore because they've got this black stuff all over them. And so it's blocking photosynthesis of understory trees. Many of the plants in the understory then will die. So the spotted lanternfly awareness began in 5 townships in Berks County in southeastern Pennsylvania. But now we see that it's established in more than half of Pennsylvania, as well as 10 other states. And what can we look for spotted lanternfly in the future? Well, about 2/3 of the contiguous United States has some level of suitability for this insect's establishment. Moreover, about 22 states have areas that are potentially highly suitable for infestations. So what do we do in extension? We share our resources and translate science for the public to help other states and agencies combat this invader and help limit the spread of this pest. So one of the things that happened a number of years ago was that the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture established a regulatory management through a quarantine in the early years of spotted lanternflies discovery in Pennsylvania. So the state quarantine is still in effect, although it's been modified several times. And although the lanternfly is not found in all 67 counties in Pennsylvania, the quarantine order affects all residents and businesses that travel throughout the state. So, and Penn State is part of the platform for doing the training for the quarantine. So just some data, 34 out of 67 counties are under the quarantine order. That's about 76% of our population. More than 38% of our farmland is involved in the quarantine. And that's over 61% of Pennsylvania's total land mass. So what do we do when we have these events where we're trying to educate the public, teach them what's going on with spotted lanternfly? Well, our objectives are, number one, we want participants, we want them to have increased knowledge and to teach other people. We want people to act to protect agriculture and natural areas. We want people to report their observations, especially important when someone's someplace where spotted lanternfly is not expected to be found and they've noticed it. I've been working with somebody who from another area whose vigilance may be very beneficial to another region in the fact that they were really alerted to the fact that spotted lanternfly was there. We want to encourage businesses to avoid spreading spotted lanternfly by getting a permit. And the permit just teaches them what to look out for, so that once they know what to look for and how to look for it, they will not be inadvertently transporting spotted lanternfly to other places. And we also hope often that residents can contribute somehow or other to research. And in the case of spotted lanternfly, they actually contributed to research sites. So we started this off by giving, and I'm going to just do a snapshot of time because we have the data for all of this. And this was between January 1st of 2019 and March 1st of 2020, right as the pandemic was sort of getting started. So this is when we really had a lot of face-to-face presentations and everything going on. So we were able to pull these data. We gave over 121 presentations to over 9,000 participants, and not just in Pennsylvania, but in other states and Canada as well. And we did a lot of web stuff as well. We responded to almost 900 different inquiries. We trained the master gardeners. We do this on an annual basis, updating them on what's going on with spotted lanternfly. But during our snapshot in time, they answered over 20,000 calls about spotted lanternfly. We got nursery growers to answer questionnaires to find out how spotted lanternfly was impacting their businesses. And so, and most of them learned something new, either about management practices or quarantine compliance. So that was a good thing. We also reached the public through the media. This is a real great opportunity to engage. We did lots of interviews. We not just interviews for general things or local things, but as many media outlets as we could find. And we also had a platform in national news outlets as well. So all these things are helping us communicate various items about the spotted lanternfly and get it out to the public so the public understands what's going on. During this period of time, we also generated a number of new fact sheets. We even had one of them, fortunately, translated into Spanish. But these are all areas that the public kept asking us for more information about. And so we were able to produce new fact sheets, get them loaded up on our website. And this was over 130,000 printed copies of these fact sheets were then distributed to the public. And over 200,000 visits to these fact sheets on our website. So clearly we're getting the public engaged. As I said, we also like it whenever we teach people and our participants teach others. Well, as an example here, a 6th grade class won the Lexus Eco Challenge Regional Award for what they did with spotted lanternfly. And that award included a $10,000 prize And these children shared their knowledge of what they learned about spotted lanternfly with a Pennsylvania state representative. That's pretty darn good. And then the Master Gardener Network's been wonderful. They've been using educational materials as well to make presentations to public groups. Another thing that was going on during this period of time, that we had participants in our meetings protecting agriculture and natural resources. And in this case, the Chester County Parks area, they went out and destroyed about 96,000 spotted lanternfly eggs. They counted all the egg masses that they were destroying. And they also went out and were able to treat trees with a systemic insecticide in order to protect certain vulnerable areas. And that management practice was valued at over $28,000. And then we have residents reporting spotted lanternflies. We taught them how to do that, and quite a few. And we also did training for permits. We, as educators and extension associates, worked with the university staff and provided images, developed the script, and narrated the course on behalf of the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. So, and we did a lot of in-person training statewide. And overall, in this snapshot of time, over 1 million permits were issued by March of 2020. And lastly, our participants really contributed research sites. We had 16 collaborators that donated sites for us. And we estimate the value of that donated land for, again, it's kind of hard to go to say, hey, can we use your vineyard to infest it with spotted lanternflies, which we know are really bad. But, you know, we worked with growers and others. And so the value of what they've done in order to help move the science forward is probably over $600,000. So really, we've worked really hard at having good communication and relations with the public, and the public has really come around and participated well in our efforts to continue to be in the leading edge of spotted lanternfly work. And that's all I've got. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Amy. And with that, we'll go to Ryan.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, thanks so much, Amy. While I get things configured here, yeah, I must say I'm a little, I don't know. Yeah, I live here in Lancaster, PA, which is kind of very close to the epicenter of lanternfly outbreaks. And I kind of see it as a success story in education and outreach. Almost every single Pennsylvanian knows about the lanternfly, and they don't know about any other conservation issues. So, you know, this kind of tells me that if we put funding and people and resources and et cetera towards all of the problems that we have, we could actually solve them. Without further ado, I'm going to jump right in, looking at the plant side of things here with invasives. I was kind of tasked with explaining kind of, you know, my relationship to invasive plants, you know, how we work around them, how we manage them in what we do. And I've intentionally titled things the almost invisible catastrophe because, yeah, as I kind of just referred to, most people that I've encountered, most casual residents have no idea that we have this invasive plant issue. It was kind of mentioned in the opening, all these biodiversity declines that we are facing. And I kind of think my hemi-professional opinion here is that the biodiversity collapse that we are about to have, thanks in large part to invasive plants, is potentially going to get us before climate change does. I think we're kind of looking at abject collapse of a lot of our ecosystems. So on that sunny note, let's go ahead and jump in. So yep, Ryan Davis with the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. I'm our Pennsylvania Forest Program Manager. So who is the Alliance? What do we do? We are 50 years old as of this year. We started right around that, you know, Clean Water Act revolution, green revolution that we had in the 1970s. We, since that time, we've been a pretty small team. And so we can't really do that much on our own. How we have decided to focus for 50 years now is by bringing people together, working with the communities, working with partners, just trying to get the work done together. And it's been a pretty effective way to go and efficient. And so our kind of main sort of pillars of our work Obviously, we are all about, restoring the Chesapeake Bay, but the way that we do that is by restoring the watershed, because, that's where people live. That's where all these resources are. If we restore the watershed, we're going to restore the resource as well, that big old estuary. So I am out of our Lancaster, PA office, our northernmost office right now. Our headquarters is in Annapolis, and then we have offices in DC and Richmond as well. Okay, so yep, and yeah, as mentioned earlier, if you want to follow along, I do a monthly tree identification series on YouTube, and we this Forest for the Bay is kind of our outreach arm for our forest program funded by the U.S. Forest Service, and so we have a lot of educational stuff that y'all might be interested in. So I would recommend checking that out, and maybe signing up for our newsletter too if you want some monthly goods from the woods, as I like to say. Okay, so to talk about kind of my relationship with invasive plants, how I work with them, first have to start with kind of, what do I do? There is Newt, the beagle right there, my cutest volunteer, potentially laziest volunteer as well, but she's always invited to our site. So what we do, my job is pretty simple: to increase the quantity and the quality of forest cover in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and then also simultaneously to increase the stewardship of and for that forest cover amongst the residents, the 18 million people that live here in the watershed. So, what does that entail? So obviously that picture there with little Newt was a riparian forest buffer site freshly planted. This is what we see all day, every day. And if you've ever wondered why those, buffer people are always such zealots about buffers, and that's all they seem to care about, this is why, because this is our life. Every day we look at this, and buffers are the way to ameliorate these catastrophic issues, really. So I want you to pay attention to the bridge here. There's my pointer, where these cows are loafing right now in the winter right next to the creek. So this is just last December, right before Christmas 2020. And then this is this last summer. So that bridge is right there. So what we do is we exclude the livestock. Here in Lancaster County especially, dairy farming is probably one of the biggest land uses that we have. And so we're usually working in that context, but if there's no livestock, then obviously we don't have to exclude them. We will just focus on the forest establishment. But this isn't where the work ends, which I think is really, really important. It's operative to this conversation and really any conversation about reforestation. If you plant this, take a picture that it's planted, and then walk away, really all you're doing is polluting. You're adding all these plastic tubes to the stream system because most of those trees will die and the tubes will wash downstream. Really, what we need to do is work very, very hard over many years until we get to this point here where we have canopy closure, and things can kind of actually start to take care of themselves, which we don't really say that often in nature, and kind of is important there. But so, in this context, specifically with reforestation, why do we need to care about invasives? Well, first and foremost, as we are trying to turn these sites into, forests, there's a lot of issues that invasive plants will bring that'll hamper that. So competing vegetation is a massive issue. Not only inside of the shelter, we'll get a lot of invasive plants growing within the shelters. Asiatic bittersweet and multiflora rose are two of the biggest. Birds will perch on the tubes and then deposit, fertilized seed packets basically into their shelters, and we'll get tons and tons and tons of weeds growing up in there that we'll need to counter. But then also in the site period, there's always a lot of invasive plants that are offering a lot of competition for light, for nutrients, but are also harboring a lot of rodents, especially voles, meadow voles, that will kill a lot of trees. So these are things that we really need to worry about. This picture here is from Bedford County. It's from my previous job where I was a CREP biologist, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. So this was a CREP planting. It was planted 10 years before I got there. So I don't know, it's probably planted in 2005 or so. And then when I get there to see, okay, it's a forest, so they can re-enroll. This is, what I would usually see. And a lot of it, pretty much all that green stuff that you see in there is Phalaris arundinacea, a reed canary grass, and an introduced species that is still being planted by government agencies to this day. It was introduced because a lot of our native vegetation that grows in wet areas is not super palatable to livestock, especially cows, like rice cut grass, carex, sedge species, juncus species, stuff like that. All of our native stuff is kind of not really good forage for livestock. So rather than us saying, well, I guess wetlands are just bad places to have livestock. We shouldn't put livestock in wetlands. We introduced this species from Eurasia that will grow in wetlands, but turns out it's not very good livestock forage either. It's just green. But we're still planting it all over. What it does is exactly what you see here. It forms this mat, this blanket of vegetation that really you're not going to get any natural regeneration through. So simultaneous to countering what we have planted, the artificial regeneration, the trees that we have stuck in here, they're smothering those, but they're also not really letting anything naturally blow in either. Now, sometimes that's good because what it's doing is it's suppressing all invasive plants except itself, right? So maybe that is a good thing, a fortunate thing, or else it would be all multiflora rows, right? But obviously, this is something that we really need to counter. Now, kind of bigger picture, the insidious threat to our ecosystem function, and I alluded to that earlier. I think everybody on here kind of already gets the deal. Non-native plant tissue is hard to digest from most native animal species, including insects. Especially with insects, those relationships are usually pretty tight because they've co-evolved for many years to have these defense mechanisms and then these counter defense mechanisms. And so if you introduce a plant, it is likely not going to be eaten by insects. And looking at those charts of how we have a couple thousand more vascular non-native plants here than in any other continent, a lot of that is because if you plant this non-native stuff here, it's going to look good because nothing's going to eat it, right? Deer resistant, right? Insect resistant, because when we want an ecosystem, when we want a food web, we want things to be eating things. Plants are kind of meant to be eaten, if you will. That's what animals do, is they eat plants. So when we kind of tug at that string on the food web, the entire thing is really kind of on the razor's edge of collapse, especially in this context now where we don't have much habitat left. We don't have a lot of forest cover. Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods is 59% forest cover, which may seem like a lot, but that's 41% less than it should be. And so, and this landscape is mostly dominated by, non-forest cover, non-native vegetation cover, and then the forests themselves are typically heavily invaded too, which we'll kind of get into in a little bit. So really the entire thing is, I'm not really exaggerating when I say it's kind of on the razor's edge. And my opening, the cover photo there is something that, you already know this, but this is the time of year to really ramp up your existential dread about invasive plants. Kind of late fall here, like around Thanksgiving, and then early spring, kind of mid-March or so. If you have green vegetation and snow on the ground at the same time, that vegetation is likely not native. So as you're driving around for the next month, even 2 months, all the green you see in the woods is not native, is strangling our native vegetation, and is simultaneously not offering anything to those ecosystems. So a lot of bad news that, again, I wish anyone would know about, but we all know to squish this little bug. But so, let's say we have a site, we have that, nasty pasture full of mud. How do you keep invasives out while you're trying to reestablish that forest? I think, in an ideal world, we would eradicate invasive plants from our areas, and then we would keep them out, but that is impossible to do, largely because there are invasive plants on every single property, not only growing, but reproducing, and they have been reproducing for like longer than my ancestors have been in this continent. You know what I mean? Like hundreds of years, these have been here in Lancaster, in this kind of in between Philly and Baltimore. I have never seen more invasive plants in my life. And I've worked as a biologist around the country. And I've seen data on that too. The numbers back that up, that this is one of the most highly invaded places that we have in this entire continent. And as we saw in that chart, that terrifying chart, our continent is blessed with being more invaded, I guess, with plants than other continents. So it would be a fool's errand for us to try to spend the very small amount of grant money that we can get to do these projects on removing these invasive plants that are going to blow in the next year after we stop that treatment. So what we do is we need to control them. And the game that I am playing is trying to establish our forest cover, because once we establish that forest cover, we will have shade, and shade is one of the biggest weapons in our toolkit for slowing down plant invasions. It's not going to keep invasive plants out, but it's going to slow them down to the point where that they can be managed pretty easily and efficiently. So how we do this, what I've kind of started to call it, is a triage. Just like, World War I, this term of triage was invented. We have all these soldiers in the battlefield with these terrible injuries, and you have to treat the people who have the worst injuries, who are more likely to die, before you can treat the people, who just have lighter injuries. And so it's the same thing for our sites. If we have invasive plants that are going to be really, really, really hard to kill, that are going to spread everywhere, that are going to pose a lot of issues to our tree growth immediately, we have to take care of them immediately. So we put those in this kind of emergency bucket. And these things kind of shuffle around. These are snippets from our handbook that we give our volunteers who help us monitor sites, which we'll talk about in just a sec. But some things, are on that remove list that are huge issues if there's a lot of them. And so how this kind of triage works is, it's not only what is our species, but how established is that species. So if, say, we have a massive multiflora rose plant that is, 10 by 10, we do have to kill that. That becomes an emergency, because that is a seed bomb. And every single shelter is going to have a multiflora rose growing up inside of it and strangling out that tree if we don't take care of that. So this is kind of that moving picture of how we are dedicating our limited time and resources into combating these invasive plants. Now, how do we combat invasive plants? Herbicide is the best tool that we have for doing that. There's a lot of acrimony about herbicide. We could kind of talk about that for probably an entire hour-long session. But if anyone can name a tool that kills a plant, not just sets it back, but kills a plant on contact, and only kills plants that it touches, then my ears are open. But that is what herbicide is. It's a targeted scientific way to manage plant tissue, and we need to target in a targeted manner and an efficient manner manage this invasive plant tissue. And a lot of what we're using chemically is aquatic safe, and are generally safer chemicals than most of our other stuff that we have. A lot of acrimony about glyphosate as well, but it's one of the safer things that we can really use, that we can purchase. So what we do is, again, we have to counter those emergency species for sure. We also have to very quickly, if not right away, counter those plants that are reproducing. There's a lot of ways to apply herbicide that I felt I didn't necessarily really need to go into. You can do a foliar application where you spray, the foliage. You can do more targeted manners, which I kind of prefer to do if possible, where you are just, a hack and squirt or an injection application, where you take a hatchet and you hack into the stem of the tree or the shrub, and then you squirt herbicide into there. Very creative name, but a very effective and very targeted way to manage these species. But a lot of times we can manage these invasive plants just by mowing, which we have to do to keep the vole cover down in order for our trees to be surviving anyway. So if an invasive plant's kind of small and it's going to get brush hogged over, we just let it rip and let the brush hog do its thing, keep it low. Once that shade gets up, then we kind of get to the point where we need to be, finally killing those plants if they haven't been killed by just kind of losing the energy in their root systems. But so here are, some of those species that kind of provide the biggest issues for us. I see I'm already getting a warning on time. Oh no. So Japanese knotweed there on the left is, I would say, the single scariest invasive plant to my knowledge. And if we detect it on site, we have to remove it. We had this lovely image here where a brand new site that was just planted last spring. Turns out there's tons and tons and tons of knotweed on site. So we had to spend a lot of money getting a professional out there to spray that. And then that there on the right, if y'all don't have the displeasure of knowing that plant, that is Japanese hops. It's a really, really bad one. I do have a video of what that can do to a site if we have time, but I don't know if I will. So how do we keep track of all these sites? We have hundreds of sites. And kind of around the watershed too. They're not just in Lancaster County, although a lot of them are. Well, necessity is the mother of all invention, as they say. And as I kind of, indicated earlier, if we can involve communities in processes, we do that any way we can. And so we have this really cool program that kind of is desperately needed, but also a really great way for people to get more involved, called Riparian Rangers, where we have volunteers who we train up and then match to a site. And they go to that site month after month during the growing season, let us know what's going on, keep an eye on the invasives and all the other things that they have to do, and tend to the trees that were just planted. That's been going since spring 2019. It's been a really awesome, effective program and a really great way to kind of get community involvement ramped up for reforestation efforts. It's been really, really spectacular. Now that kind of third pillar, I'm almost there, Denise, sorry, I'll sprint. The third pillar of the quality of forest cover, invasive plants in woods are one of the biggest, barriers that we have to quality, sustainable forest cover. So, both of these pictures, the forest floor is completely carpeted with invasive plants. Something that's kind of interesting to note in forest systems is we have invasive plants that are really, really big problems that are actually native to those systems, but they are invading because of a complete lack of fire suppression for about 100 years now, and a complete overabundance of deer that are selectively eating every single thing except these plant species. And so what we get is, these carpets, nothing is going to regenerate. Most woods that I've been in the East have very little tree regeneration on the forest floor, which again, we're on the razor's edge of abject collapse. So all those trees will eventually die. If they die and nothing regenerates underneath them, then we have a monoculture of an invasive plant. I have done bird surveys in habitats that look exactly like this, and they are quiet, very, very quiet during the breeding season. There's like robins are like the only thing, deep in the woods too. I'm talking hours from towns. You still don't get any life really in these systems. So bad news. So one of the programs, the ways that we kind of interface, as the Alliance Forest team with these sites is trying to help small size landowners to do this kind of work. There's a lot of programs out there to help landowners do sustainable forestry, but mostly they're focused on larger forest landowners, and your smaller forested property typically has a hard time kind of following the sort of conventional model of you do a sustainable timber harvest and then you take the proceeds from that sale to do all the work for decades to get to the point where you can do a sustainable timber harvest. Most small landowners don't have enough timber, especially because it's been so degraded by bad timbering practices for decades. They don't have enough money to be able to do that, So what we are doing is we're rebuilding scale. We're building these networks of smaller landowners that are nearby each other so that we can have more scale and we can bring contractors in to remove stuff. So here's an example. Most of our landowners who tap into our program are using our funds for invasive plant treatments because that's kind of the biggest need that we have for forest sustainability. So I don't think I have time to show my video, but imagine me just trying to pull hops off of a tree tube for about 45 seconds, and that's it. So thanks everybody. Hope I provided some nice perspective here today.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan, you did. And so just a reminder to our attendees, I moderate the discussion out of the chat. So if you can enter your questions in the chat, that would be great. But I'll start with one and ask you each. With the numbers of invasives, it seems to me both of you have to prioritize in some fashion, right? And so it takes a while to understand potential impact, right? And you lose the ability to have a timely response if you're waiting to fully understand the ecological impact of something. So I guess I'm going to ask each one of you, maybe Amy, you can go first, and then Ryan, how do you approach that? You can't afford for everything to be a priority, right? So how do you treat when you first see something? How do you sort of do a quick assessment about impact and whether that's something that deserves emergency treatment?
I think what we first do is we go to the literature and what can we learn from the literature that exists. And for some of our invasive species, we can learn things about what had happened in other places where it invaded. And Spotted Lanternfly did that in Korea. But also understanding more about how certain invasive species interact in their own environment. That's where we start. That's where you guess. Secondly, I wasn't here in Pennsylvania for the beginning of the Spotted Lanternfly issue, but I think when I talked to my colleagues, there was really a concern up front, simply in this case, because it was a nuisance. It all started with being a nuisance, and then people started observing what it did. So I don't have an easy answer, but I think it's a combination of observation and what we already know from science.
Thanks, Amy. Ryan?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, my thinking about, why does your average person not care? It's because it's not a nuisance to them, because your average person goes from their house to their car to wherever they're going, to then their car, to then their house, and then that's that. And then maybe they'll go in their backyard where they just mow everything, so they don't have to worry about what plants are what, because they just mow everything, right? And that's kind of how a majority of us Americans kind of live and interact with the landscape. So yeah, invasive plants are not a problem to most people, and that's why they don't know about them, but they kind of need to know about these, emerging issues. So yeah, it's challenging because so when we're doing, a riparian forest buffer, your usual grant funding that you can get, they'll want to give you maybe anywhere between $4,000 to $6,000 an acre to do that work. And that is, so we're trying to create a forest out of nothing for $4,000 to $6,000, and there's very little room for the invasive plant work in there, especially in such a heavily invaded area. So yeah, that triage is an incredibly valuable tool for us of kind of what are our immediate threats, what are our kind of secondary threats, what can we put on the back burner, what can we handle with mechanical means, what do we have to do with herbicide, what can we have volunteers be just hand pulling so that we're suppressing things. And then two, the big thing I think with invasive plants is focusing on those seed sources. So what are our big nasty shrubs that are on site that are just churning out tons and tons and tons of seed that are going to become thousands of little issues later. And so that really kind of helps. And, fortunately, with invasive plant management, we've been doing it for several decades. So I have a real jump on it. We don't have a novel invasion of a bug that we have to try to figure out. And luckily, actually, Penn State has really fantastic resources on how to effectively do these treatments and what chemicals to use, what time of year, that kind of stuff. So we can just kind of follow the examples of folks who have paved the way with research before us. But it's a matter of taking all that and then applying it pragmatically with a shoestring budget, which I guess is just kind of what I do. That's my life in a nutshell.
Thanks, Ryan. And we've got a lot of questions piling up in the chat. So I'll try if we can sort of make sure we make time for as many of them as we can. So the first one is from a watershed planner in Anne Arundel County, Douglas Griffith. How do you feel watershed managers should approach established non-native invasive riparian communities that are otherwise providing services such as stream shading, bank stabilization, et cetera? This is a great question. What level of time and money should be spent into removal replacement? And so it seems to me a really great question about how you're balancing the ecosystem services that is providing, and whether it's worth spending the time and money getting rid of the invasives so that you gain some of these other services. So let's go in the opposite order. Ryan, do you want to address that briefly, and then we'll ask Amy?
Yeah, that is really tricky. This is a big issue for sure, because the reality is that, for sure, we're stabilizing stream banks. It's a natural filter. But a lot of the benefits of a riparian forest for water quality is that we are protecting and enabling a functioning aquatic ecosystem to filter the water for us. So Stroud Water Research Center, based out of Chester County here in PA, has data for decades that if you have a functioning macroinvertebrate community on the bottom of that stream, you're going to have 2 to 8 times the filtration power as a kind of depauperate, macroinvertebrate community. So it's really important for us to actually have native vegetation there. All those leaves that are falling into the creek, if they're not native, they're not going to be utilized by those bugs, and we're not going to get that in-stream functioning that we need to have clean water, because we're polluting so much that's kind of the only hope that we have for clean water is that in-stream functioning. And so obviously it's really, really challenging, because a lot of these areas that are naturalized that might have just been like a weird scruffy area in a very developed context or an agricultural context, a lot of the existing riparian forest cover is just kind of, it was in the way, or it would have been challenging for us to do something else with that territory. So we just kind of haven't done anything with it. And so we've kind of opened the door for invasions gradually over decades and decades. And so yeah, what do you do if you have $5,000? Do you take that $5,000 and repair something you already have, or do you take it and establish a new forest? I think one of the things that we can do, yeah, I've been complaining about half of the time I've had my mic on about, most people kind of not understanding invasive plant issues, but a lot of people do. And a lot of people really want to get out there and help. And so there are some programs. Riparian Rangers is just one of the many volunteer stewardship programs. There's Weed Warriors in Maryland that I think there's a bunch of chapters in Maryland where basically it's groups of people who just want to kill invasive plants. And so they just go do a lot of invasive plant management. And so I would say, connecting to a group like that or fostering or starting a group like that to work on these kind of longer term invasive plant, reduction strategies, I think would be really valuable. There's limited resources out there and time, but by bringing other people in who might have a little bit more time, that would maybe be a good way to do it. So, because unfortunately, the reality is that we can't afford to not do anything, and we also can't afford to take that $5,000 and plant another buffer too. So we kind of have to do both. So that's my convoluted, complicated answer. How about you, Amy?
Yeah. Amy, do you have anything to add?
I like his Ryan, I like your convoluted answer, because you've touched on so many aspects. One of the most important one is a lot of people don't really understand or appreciate. And so I really can't add too much more to that, because we see it all the time, or they don't even understand what's going on in their own backyards. So I thought that was a really good summary.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me, there's one from David Hunter, and I think this might be able to be answered in a short way. I noticed kudzu on the Virginia side of the bridge over the Potomac at Harper's Ferry. Are we going to have to start dealing with more kudzu in Maryland, and what methods are most effective? It's a pretty direct question.
Yeah, I guess I'm doing the plant side. So, and Amy's doing the six-legged side. Yeah, so nice thing about kudzu is that it doesn't really spread too much by seed. It's mostly vegetative reproduction. So kudzu has a really bad reputation, but I would prefer kudzu over almost any invasive plant that I work with on a daily basis. Maybe that's just because the enemies that you are closer to you are closer at heart. But yeah, it very well could, creep over into Maryland any old time, especially because people dig stuff up, plant it all over the place. And kind of for perspective, I grew up in Virginia, North Carolina. So kudzu is very, very, very familiar with me. I'm a son of kudzu myself. But yeah, herbicide is actually pretty effective at managing kudzu. We didn't really talk about organic options, but organic options are out there. Goats will go crazy on kudzu and a bunch of other things. Now, what do you do to ameliorate the negative impacts of goats, another non-native species, on your ecosystem? That's kind of the door you open when you invite those little devils in. Yeah, do you have anything to add to that, Amy? Yeah, I guess. Yeah, that's all I have to say about it.
Not really. I think it's here, and we can expect kudzu to hang around for a while.
Amy, actually, there's a question that I think is going to be perfect for you from Rebecca at Ponchenil. It seems that with Ryan's work, there are priorities being set in terms of protecting high-value forest and in terms of newly planted sites, and then prioritizing based on potential species harm. With Spotted Lanternfly, is there a landscape scale prioritization going on in terms of protecting certain high value areas or preventing spread from key sources?
The priorities were sort of established with regard to impact on in agricultural sectors. What parts of the agricultural industry would be most affected by spotted lanternfly. And but a large part of that is we're still waiting to determine it. We don't have enough. We know that it affects grapes. We know the spotted lanternflies feed on hops as well, but we know that it does have an impact on certain things. But I don't know that we have enough data to actually say overall what the impact is. And then whenever you go out into the natural environment. We're not talking, we're talking watersheds, we're talking woodland areas, and Pennsylvania is a great state for woodlands. I mean, this is another industry for Pennsylvania. We're the largest producer of hardwoods in the country, actually. And so we look at all the woodland areas that we have, and we don't really have accurate measurements of what spotted lanternfly is doing in some of those areas as well. And again, just like with looking at the watershed areas, not enough people, not enough time, not enough money to really really tease it out. It's sort of first come, first served. What do we know that it's really hitting hardest up front, and then working on it from there?
Okay.
Wish I had a better answer.
No, that's great. I'm going to keep going, actually, because there's a lot more questions and probably we're going to have time. One is maybe, Ryan, if there's a short one to this is my favorite invader. Grace Brush is asking, what is being done about Japanese stilt grass?
Yeah, it's always kind of funny that what's your favorite invader? That is a question. If anyone ever interviews with me someday, I always ask that in my interviews: is what is the invasive plant you hate the most? And it's a really interesting what people say. It actually is a really good interview question. Kind of shows a lot about who they are and their experience. Anyway, so stiltgrass is a complete nightmare. That was one of the ones that was in that slide about mature forest cover. I mentioned that a lot of our invasive plants shade slows down substantially. Stiltgrass is not one of those plants. It does fine kind of everywhere. And it kind of infamously, the seeds remain viable in the seed bank for quite a long time, up to 7 years, usually more towards 3, but up to 7. So what you have to do is you have to kill the existing plant at the appropriate times that it is not going to seed, and then you have to treat that ground so that the seed will not germinate fully. So there are pre-emergent herbicides. Oust is a good brand name herbicide, and the chemical compounds escaping my brain here right now. So those pre-emergent herbicides, what they do is right when the plant starts to emerge, that's when the chemical kills it. And so that is a really effective way to manage it. Now, however, that's a lot of chemical that you have to put in the woods. And that is a lot of time and money too. So it is really hard to do that on a large area because our entire state is kind of loaded with stiltgrass. So it's again a matter of priorities, but it can be done, and it is being done all the time.
Here's a question for you both from Fred Dobbs at ODU. I've rubbed shoulders over the years with a cadre of extension agents, educators, etc., whose concerns are with marine invasive species. Do either of you trade stories, best practices, or communication techniques with your counterparts working with marine invasive species?
I'll go I was first to the draw here. I'll go first. I never do anything with marine species personally, even though I kind of my organization touches that estuary of the bay. I don't do anything with marine species, but I will say just invasives period. A lot of us biologists, ecologists, we like to drink beer, and we like to do it while talking and commiserating and strategizing together. So I would say we do swap secrets a lot, generally speaking, although we haven't done that in a couple of years now because of COVID, but maybe someday. Amy, do you have anything else?
Similarly, I have not really done any or been asked anything about marine invasives, but at our national meetings, like the National Association of County Agricultural Agents, we have talked about our communication processes and our techniques and sharing. So at a broader scale, we share our experiences, but I've got nothing related to marine invasives.
With that, I believe we'll almost, I'll just remind the attendees, if you didn't hear your question being asked, we do forward those to the panelists, and you will get an email with their responses to your questions just to make sure that all questions get answered. And with that, because we're almost time, I'll just thank Amy and Ryan for a really fascinating hour. I'll let people know that Wednesday, December 15th is our next CRC Roundtable. The topic is PFAS. And I just ask Amy or Ryan if you have any, one sentence messages you'd like to leave us with. Amy, you want to go first?
I appreciate what everybody's doing and your attention. And I just think it's great that y'all can get out there and share your messages. So I think that's wonderful. And thank you for joining me today.
And Ryan, what would you like us to leave with?
Yeah, I think for me, this is maybe very focused on kind of what I do of vegetation management. The biggest kind of barrier, I think, is just getting started. Just if you want to do this kind of thing, if you want to do reforestation, if you want to work on invasive plants, whatever, the only way to start is to start. So get started. You're going to make a bunch of mistakes, but they're plants. They're going to come back. It'll be fine. If a bunch of your trees die, you replant. You figure out why they died. You make sure it doesn't happen. You keep trucking. And that's the only way we're going to make any progress, is if we're not really afraid to fail in the short term. Yeah, forests are kind of, thousands of years kind of spectrum. So we're just a tiny little part of that. All we got to do is get them started and let them do their things. So thanks, everybody. Happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone.